shocked when you learn how soldiers survived on the battlefields during World War II? We are used to seeing war in movies as a series of heroic attacks and battles. But what was a soldier's life really like? It consisted of waiting, cold, and a constant exhausting desire to sleep for at least an hour. These inhuman conditions gave rise to remarkable ingenuity, turning everyday objects into tools for survival. Heroism was evident not only in attacks, but also in the quiet, daily struggle against circumstances. Here, resourcefulness became the main weapon in the battle for rest. Watch the video to the end to find out how the Soviet raincoat tent was turned into a collective bedroom, and why British soldiers sometimes preferred to sleep sitting up rather than lying down. What if I told you that the main enemy of sleep in war was not the cold, but your own brain? Soldiers had to learn to turn off their instinct for self-preservation, which screamed of danger. This was the first and most important trick that a recruit had to learn. Veterans developed a kind of sleep discipline. They learned to fall asleep instantly on command, in any position and with any noise. This ability was valued no less than the ability to shoot accurately, because a well-rested soldier is an effective soldier. Soldiers trained themselves not to react to distant sounds of battle. They developed an internal filter that filtered out the usual hum and only responded to close, truly dangerous sounds. This skill was the key to preserving sanity and strength. Many used psychological tricks to deceive their fear. They mentally returned home, remembering peaceful days and the faces of their loved ones. These brief mental escapes helped them relax and fall into a short, restless sleep. Some soldiers, on the contrary, tried not to think about anything. They concentrated on their own breathing or on the monotonous tapping of rain on their helmets. Any method was good to silence the brain and give the body the rest it so desperately needed. American psychologists noted that soldiers often dreamed of simple, everyday things. They did not dream of battles, but of clean beds, hot food, and silence. Sleep became the only place where they could hide from the reality of war. Soldiers often slept hugging their weapons. This was not only a requirement of the regulations, but also a psychological necessity. Holding a rifle gave the illusion of control and security, allowing them to relax their tense nerves a little. Lack of sleep was as much a weapon as artillery. The enemy was deliberately exhausted by night attacks and harassing fire. The goal was not so much to inflict damage as to deprive enemy soldiers of rest and reduce their combat effectiveness. Experienced fighters understood that sleep was as much a resource as ammunition or food. It had to be obtained, valued, and used wisely. The ability to find opportunities for rest in any conditions was one of the main talents of a soldier. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about the psychological component of survival in war? Write about it in the comments. Want to know the secret that saves soldiers from the cold and damp? The answer is simple: the ground. A regular dugout, or foxhole, was the first and most reliable shelter that soldiers created for themselves, and it also became their bedroom. Building such a shelter was a science in itself. It was important to choose the right place so that the cell would not be flooded by the first rain. Soldiers looked for small hills or slopes from which water could drain. First, a simple rectangular trench was dug, about waist deep. This already provided protection from the wind and shrapnel. But for proper rest, this was not enough. It was necessary to create a semblance of a roof. They used whatever was at hand to cover it. They used branches, boards from broken boxes, and pieces of iron. This covering was then covered with a layer of earth for camouflage and additional protection. Inside, the foxhole was very cramped. There was just enough room for one or two people to lie or sit, pressed tightly against each other. But this cramped space had its advantages. It was warmer. They tried to line the bottom of the trench with something dry: pine branches, straw, empty sacks. All this created an insulating layer between the body and the cold, damp ground. It was a simple but effective way to combat hypothermia. The entrance to such a shelter was usually covered with a raincoat or a piece of tarpaulin. This protected against wind and rain and also kept the precious heat inside. The result was a tiny but private home. Soldiers constantly improved their dwellings. They made small niches in the walls to store personal belongings and ammunition. They even added steps for easier entry and exit. In conditions of positional warfare, such foxholes could be connected by trenches, forming entire underground cities. Soldiers lived in them for weeks, and these cramped, dark shelters became their only synonym for safety and home. How important do you think cleanliness was in such improvised dwellings? The answer to this question may surprise you, but first, in the next chapter, we will learn how resourcefulness turned trash into valuable resources for everyday life. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of soldierly ingenuity. In war, there is no such thing as trash, only resources that have not yet found their use. This simple truth has given rise to thousands of amazing inventions that made life in the trenches a little more bearable. For example, ordinary tin cans were turned into a universal building material. They were filled with earth and used as bricks to reinforce the walls of dugouts. Such a storage wall provided excellent protection against dampness. Empty shell casings were also put to good use. They were used to make stoves, lamps, and even mugs. A large howitzer shell casing could be used as a wash basin or a container for collecting rainwater. Spent rifle cartridge cases were used as raw material for lighters. This was a whole underground industry that required considerable skill. Such a brass lighter was not afraid of moisture and was a source of pride and a valuable item for exchange. German gasoline cans made excellent, lightweight stoves. All you had to do was cut out a door and a hole for the pipe. Such a stove quickly heated a small dugout and allowed clothes to be dried. Wire, especially barbed wire, was a universal tool. It was used to reinforce floors, create hanging shelves, and protect belongings from dampness and mice. It was even used to weave something resembling bed nets. Broken equipment became a source of valuable parts. Rubber gaskets from tanks were used for waterproofing. Seats from trucks were moved to officers' dugouts, becoming a luxury item. American soldiers made improvised showers from punctured helmets. The helmet was hung on a tree filled with water, and several small holes created the effect of a shower head. It was a simple way to maintain hygiene in the field. Even glass from broken bottles found a use. Its shards were inserted into the top of the trench parapet. It was a simple alarm system. An enemy attempting to climb over the parapet at night would inevitably make noise. These examples show that soldiers at war were not only fighters, but also engineers. They were forced to constantly invent, adapt, and find unconventional solutions. Their lives depended on this everyday ingenuity, no less than on the serviceability of their weapons. What I am about to show you was indispensable for every soldier. There were two items on a soldier's personal equipment list that could rightly be called universal. These were the overcoat and the raincoat tent, which served as clothing, a bed, and a home for the soldier. The overcoat was not just outerwear. At night, it turned into a blanket, the only thing that protected against the piercing cold. Soldiers learned to wrap themselves in it in a special way to retain as much body heat as possible. In severe frosts, the overcoat became part of a multi-layered warming system. Soldiers wore all their available clothing underneath it, creating air pockets. It was a simple but effective way to prevent frostbite. The overcoat also served as a pillow. Rolled up into a cylinder, it was placed under the head, allowing the neck muscles to relax a little. Sleeping on the bare ground or at the bottom of a trench was much harder. If the overcoat was a blanket, then the Soviet raincoat tent was an entire sleeping system. This simple piece of canvas with eyelets and buttons was a brilliant invention. It could be used to make an individual raincoat, but its main advantage was revealed when used collectively. Two raincoats were joined together to form a small gable tent for two soldiers. 4 raincoats turned into a house for 4. These improvised tents provided protection from wind and precipitation. A microclimate was created inside, and it was significantly warmer than outside. Soldiers slept huddled together, warming each other with their body heat. The raincoat tent also served as a bedding. Spread out on the bottom of a trench or on the snow, it insulated against moisture and cold coming from the ground. Sleeping on it was much more comfortable and safer for health. It was used as a stretcher to carry comrades. The strength of the canvas and the presence of special openings made it possible to quickly construct a reliable means of evacuation. This functionality saved many lives. In essence, the greatcoat and raincoat tent were the basis of a soldier's life. They provided a minimal but vital level of comfort. Losing these items was tantamount to disaster. as it meant being left alone with the cold and damp. Ready to learn how soldiers slept in completely destroyed cities? In the next chapter, we will talk about life in basements and ruins. War in the city dictated its own rules of survival. The ruins of Stalingrad, Warsaw, and Berlin became new battlefields. There was no way to dig trenches here, so basements became the main shelter and sleeping quarters for soldiers. The basement provided excellent protection from artillery fire and bombing. Thick brick or concrete walls and ceilings could withstand even a direct hit. It was the safest place in a destroyed city. However, life in the basements was a difficult ordeal. Constant darkness, dampness, and stale air all had a depressing effect. The soldiers had to get used to living underground, like moles. They slept right on the floor, covering themselves with whatever they could find. Old doors, broken furniture, rags, and waste paper were used. Any object that created a layer between the body and the cold concrete floor was worth its weight in gold. One of the main problems was fighting the cold. In unheated basements, the temperature could drop below zero in winter. The soldiers huddled together to keep warm, sleeping in shifts while others kept watch at makeshift stoves. Sometimes they managed to find surviving furniture. An old sofa or bed found in the rubble became a real treasure for the entire unit. They took turns sleeping on them, and it was considered a great luxury. The upper floors of destroyed buildings were also used for rest, but less often. They were more dangerous, but it was easier to keep watch from there. The soldiers set up observation posts there and slept in fits and starts right by the windows or holes in the walls. Sleeping was incredibly stressful. The enemy could be in the neighboring stairwell or on another floor of the same building. Any rustle could mean the start of a battle, so sleep was very light. The city ruins also provided a wealth of materials for everyday life. Broken bricks were used to build stoves, and rebar was used to make hooks for equipment. Soldiers quickly learned to use the chaos of destruction to their advantage. Sleep in the ruins was a symbol of the entire war. A fragile, brief respite amid total destruction. It was only possible thanks to camaraderie and the ability to adapt. Soldiers created their own order in daily life, where it seemed that only death could exist. What if I showed you a time machine? Let's travel back to the winter of 1941 near Moscow. It's 40 degrees below zero, with deep snow and wind. In such conditions, sleep became a matter of survival in the truest sense of the word. The main enemy was not so much the cold as the inability to keep warm. Wet clothes turned into an icy shell in the cold. Falling asleep in such a state meant never waking up again. Soviet soldiers were better prepared for such conditions. Quilted jackets, felt boots, and fur hats all gave them an advantage. But even in such clothing, sleeping in the snow was deadly dangerous. The main way to survive was to organize collective liegans. A large hole was dug in the snow, and the bottom was lined with a thick layer of spruce branches. A canopy was constructed on top from raincoats and branches, which was also covered with snow. A small fire was lit inside such a shelter. When the ground and walls warmed up, the fire was extinguished and the coals were removed. After that, all the openings were tightly closed, and the soldiers lay down to sleep on the warm ground, huddling close together. The warmth in such a den lasted for several hours. This was enough to sleep in relative comfort and safety. The smoke from the fire had time to dissipate, and the position remained undetected by the enemy. German soldiers, who had no experience of surviving in such conditions, suffered much more. Their greatcoats and boots were not designed for Russian frosts. They saved themselves by wrapping themselves in blankets and any clothing taken from the local population. They also used dugouts, but often did so incorrectly. Insufficient ventilation led to carbon monoxide poisoning from stoves. This was a silent and terrible danger of winter life. Sometimes soldiers slept right in the snow, digging out individual cells for themselves. They lay down on a layer of pine branches and covered themselves with a raincoat, which they sprinkled with snow. Snow, paradoxically, is a good heat insulator. Winter sleep at the front was a constant struggle. It required not only endurance, but also knowledge, collective effort, and strict discipline. How important do you think psychological resilience was in such conditions? The sleep of the entire unit depended directly on a few people: the sentries. It was their responsibility to ensure the safety of their sleeping comrades. Their service was one of the most difficult and exhausting. Standing guard, especially at night, was a huge test of the psyche. The darkness, the silence interrupted by random sounds. All this created enormous tension. The sentry had to fight not only the cold, but also his own imagination. The sentry's main enemy was sleep. The monotony of observation, fatigue, and cold caused an irresistible desire to close their eyes for at least a second. Falling asleep on duty was considered one of the most serious military crimes. To stay awake, soldiers resorted to various tricks. They paced back and forth, pinched themselves, whispered to themselves. Some chewed on crackers or smoked, if the situation allowed. Experienced fighters knew that the most dangerous time was the early morning hours. At this time, the human body is most relaxed, and it becomes almost impossible to fight sleep. The most reliable and steadfast soldiers were usually assigned to this time. The sentries worked in pairs. This was not only safer, but also easier psychologically. They could exchange a few words, support each other, which helped to chase away drowsiness. The system of post was organized so as to cover all sectors of fire. The sentries constantly maintained visual or audio contact with each other. There was a whole system of code signals in case the enemy was detected. The changing of the guard was one of the most eagerly awaited moments. After standing for 2 or 3 hours in the cold or rain, the soldiers dreamed of only one thing: getting to their shelter and falling asleep. The contrast between the tension on duty and the relaxation in the dugout was enormous. The lives of dozens, even hundreds of people depended on the vigilance of the sentries. Their quiet, invisible feat was repeated every night on all fronts. It was they who, by staying awake, bought precious hours of rest for their comrades. This invisible side of war rarely makes it into films, but it was the basis of a soldier's life. The safety of one depended on the responsibility of another. That was the main law of frontline brotherhood. War is not only about sitting in trenches, but also about constant movement. Soldiers had to sleep in the most unsuitable places, in the back of trucks, in freight cars, and on the decks of landing ships. This sleep on the march had its own peculiarities. During troop transfers, soldiers crammed into heated cars or truck beds so tightly that they could only sleep sitting up. Long journeys became a real ordeal. Constant shaking, rumbling, and cramped conditions made it impossible to rest properly. Soldiers learned to sleep in any position, leaning against the wall of the car or the shoulder of a neighbor. This sleep was superficial and intermittent, but even such rest was better than no rest at all. Sometimes it was possible to settle down with greater comfort. In the trains, they built 2 or 3 tiers of bunks. This allowed the soldiers to stretch out to their full height, which was a real luxury. It was almost impossible to sleep in the back of trucks while they were moving. Soldiers dozed off in fits and starts during short stops. They jumped out of the vehicles and lay down directly on the ground, using the wheels as protection from the wind. Sea crossings were another kind of ordeal. On the decks of landing ships, soldiers lay huddled together, sheltering from the salty spray. The rocking of the ship caused seasickness, which made it difficult to sleep. It was warmer in the holds, but stuffy and cramped. Soldiers slept on multi-tiered bunks suspended on chains. Anyone who has served in the Navy knows how specific this kind of sleep is. They had to sleep in full combat readiness. At any moment, the alarm could sound, and they would have to take their places according to the combat schedule. This tension did not allow them to completely relax. Sleeping on the march was part of a soldier's job. It was as exhausting and difficult as the many kilometers of marching. It was the price of the Army's mobility. Nevertheless, soldiers found small pleasures in this as well. The opportunity to stretch their legs at a stop, a mug of hot tea drunk in the train car, all of this was greatly appreciated. People are capable of adapting to any conditions. Military doctors quickly realized that chronic sleep deprivation was a serious medical problem. Fatigue reduced reaction time, concentration, and the ability to make sound decisions. A tired soldier was an easy target. The consequences of sleep deprivation were varied. In addition to obvious physical exhaustion, it led to psychological problems. Soldiers became irritable, apathetic, or, conversely, overly aggressive. Doctors insisted on the need to provide soldiers with regular rest. Special rest areas were organized in the rear, where units were taken after heavy fighting. Here, for the first time in many weeks, soldiers could wash and sleep in normal conditions. Even a few days of such rest worked wonders. Soldiers regained their physical and moral strength. This was as important as replenishing ammunition and food supplies. In the field, doctors and medics monitored the condition of the soldiers. They could recommend that the commander give additional rest to the most exhausted soldiers. The overall combat effectiveness of the unit depended on this. There were also medical drugs to combat fatigue. The Allied armies, for example, used amphetamines. They allowed soldiers and pilots to stay awake for long periods of time, but had serious side effects. However, the main cure for fatigue was and remained ordinary sleep. No chemical could replace proper rest. Therefore, organizing daily life and providing opportunities for sleep were an important part of military planning. Doctors also struggled with the consequences of sleeping in poor conditions. Hypothermia, trench foot, colds. All of these were direct consequences of living in damp and cold conditions. Prevention was more important than treatment. Soldiers were taught simple rules of sleep hygiene. It was necessary, if possible, to take off wet shoes at night and massage the feet to restore blood circulation. These simple actions saved them from disability. Thus, sleep in war was not just a daily necessity, it was an important factor affecting the combat effectiveness of the army. Commanders who understood this gained a significant advantage over their enemies. When veterans were asked what they missed most during the war, many answered, silence. The constant background noise, the roar of artillery, the crackle of machine guns, the shouting, was an integral part of life at the front. It never stopped, day or night. Complete silence on the front lines was a rare and alarming phenomenon. It usually meant either the calm before the storm or that the enemy was plotting something. Soldiers got used to the noise and became nervous when it suddenly stopped. Because of this constant noise, sleep was never deep. It was more like a half-sleep, a state from which one could instantly return to reality. The body was in a constant state of readiness. Soldiers learned to sleep through the cannon fire. They got used to the sounds of their artillery and could distinguish them from the sounds of the enemies. This skill came with experience. But even after getting used to the noise, the soldiers dreamed of silence. The brief moments when the fighting subsided were incredibly precious. It was an opportunity to hear birds singing, leaves rustling, the sounds of peaceful life. In these moments, it was possible to try to fall asleep for real, to relax without expecting an explosion or the command to battle at any second. These short hours were the best rest. We see that sleep in war was not just rest, but a whole science of survival. It required not only endurance from the soldier, but also wit, discipline, and enormous psychological fortitude. Every minute of peace was won from the circumstances, from the cold, the dirt, and the constant danger. Behind each of these everyday feats, from digging a foxhole to making a trench candle, lies an unyielding will to live. These stories show us another side of war, devoid of pathos and romance. It is a harsh lesson in how important it is to appreciate peace and the simple comforts it gives us. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. What else would you be interested in learning about from the everyday life of soldiers during World War II? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.